What's up guys? In this video we'll be looking at the new Wilson Blade V9. Let's take a moment to explore what a blade represented as a racket option in my opinion. A blade was a racket that allowed players to transition from user-friendly tweener rackets, which were 100 square inches, thick beam, high stiffness and lightweight, which represented power, forgiveness and ease of use. The blade was an introduction to thinner beams, a head-heavier balance, and a racket that would require more self-generation of power, but not on the extreme. It was the perfect blend of performance that was right in the middle of a tweener and the most advanced player rackets, where it required the user to learn better technique and true racket head speed for optimal usage. Aside from the V7 where it had the most drastic change in feel, the V8 was where the identity was lost a little bit, where the swing weight was lowered on average to a point where the racket became more of a platform racket in need of customization. In addition, it became a little less forgiving and lower powered. More than ever, it became a racket about control and feel compared to previous iterations of the blade. For me, the Ultra Pro was just a better feeling and performing racket in the exact same category, so personally I thought it started to lose a bit of its uniqueness and began to blend in with the rest of Wilson's advanced line of rackets. Before we get into it, as always, if you liked the video, help me by giving it a thumbs up for the algorithm, subscribe for more reviews, follow me on Instagram for updates, and you can support the channel by buying me a coffee or giving me a super thanks. Moving on to the Blade V9, let's check the intended specs versus the specs I received. The head size is obviously 98 square inches and it comes in a 16, 19 and 18-20 string pattern. It has an unstrung weight of 305 grams, and if you add strings into it, it would be around 323 grams depending on what string you use. The beam width is a constant 20.6mm beam, but on some websites it's rounded up to 21mm, which the shape of the beam is referred to as a D-beam. The strung balance is around 33cm or 4 points headlight and about 32cm unstrung. The average swing weight that Tennis Warehouse has at the moment is currently 324, and the stiffness rating is 62 RA, which is a bit of a surprise to me as the V8 was 61 RA stiffness. So what did Wilson update and what did I receive? So they implemented a new technology called Stable Feel, which was basically to add 10% more stability, slightly firming up the racket to allow for greater stability and easier access to power. Also, they looked at improving quality control, which they are claiming a 25% improvement on quality control. Finally, there is an addition of snap-on grommets, which in theory should work very well, but I don't tend to destroy my head guards very often, so I can't comment on that and I'm probably not going to utilize it very often. Stable Feel is probably just a way of looking to increase the overall swing weight and weight distribution to the sides of the racket. In my opinion, a V8 that came in overweight or overspec'd actually was a very good stock racket. It was already very stable and it wasn't too slow or head heavy. The problem was generally receiving an average or low swing weight that was going to play flimsy regardless, and now that Wilson has probably ended up fiddling with the internal weight distribution of the racket, that's naturally going to increase the stability no matter what. Which moves us to quality control, where Wilson is claiming a supposed 25% improvement. My opinion, because we don't know what they are focusing on when it comes to the quality control, whether it's both static weight and balance or just one of the two. With all racket brands, swing weight is not a spec that is listed or measured because that's a lot more difficult to achieve consistently and that would cost a lot more money to do so. But with Yonex, they are more often than not quality controlling both the static weight and the balance point to be of a tighter standard. And many times you'll find that Yonex rackets have both measurements controlled. And thus you'll find the swing weight averages almost fall in line to a true range more often than not with the Tennis Warehouse averages. Of course, you're going to get outliers here and there, but Yonex do a very good job at swing weight control as well. My Blade V9 spec was exactly 305 grams, however the balance was slightly more head heavy at 33.5 centimeters, almost 2 points more than the advertised spec. And whilst that might not seem like much, but if Wilson truly are targeting a higher average swing weight, any additional weight to the head becomes problematic. My swing weight was 330 with a regular gauge string, and for me my max swing weight is already 330. My best spec is about 325, so already my experience is going to be hampered by the beefier swing weight in stock form because the balance is not to my liking, all of which affect my own performance. Also, if you open up the butt cap to my frame, I have silicone in the handle. Normally that's very rare to see in a retail racket. You would only find that in a pro stock most likely. In my opinion, there are two reasons for this. The original spec, they had to intervene and fix the specs themselves to make it a tolerable range, or this is their way of tightening their quality control, where they are going through a few more of them to add as a post-control measure. And what I'm willing to bet is that they are concentrating on static weight only. You're going to find a lot of ones where the static weight falls in line, and the balance is not taken into account. So the distribution of the weight can be all over the place, and you'll find that the swing weights are going to be very random. Obviously, this is all theoretical on my end, but I will give Wilson a lot of props for trying to improve it in some ways, but more often than not, for the higher swing weight average racket lines, I'm going to try to buy an underspec'd one almost every time. Based on my spec, you would technically give Wilson a pass in terms of QC, because it did fall right on the correct unstrung weight, and the balance was only slightly off. Just unfortunate that I would have preferred if the balance was a bit more head light than head heavy, which allowed me more room to add weight. Whereas it's almost impossible to decrease swing weight without messing with some of the fundamental structures of the frame or compromising my favorite string setup. For string setups and modifications, I tried all these strings in the setups and tensions that you see on the overlay. And to clarify, I don't actually like customizing a lot. I'm generally a minimalist, doing the smallest amount possible to address issues that I have personally for my own playstyle. I avoid adding extra weight normally because it usually is detrimental to my game, as I rely on maximum racket head speed. I'm that sensitive enough to notice the feel of difference between adding 5 grams of static weight can sometimes be less optimal for my swing. The problem I've had with the blade is that an off-spec could completely ruin your experience, whether it's too light or too heavy. If it's too light, many people don't know or don't want to fiddle with customization, especially when you don't have the right tools to measure exactly what you're doing, and it's a complete guessing game. Again, if it's too light, at the very least you could add and remove weight where necessary. When you have an overspec swing weight like I did for my V9, this completely dictates the whole experience. 330 for me these days is just pushing it more than I want or need, especially when the balance is about 2 points headlight, where I perform best at 6 or 7 points headlight. So for all new users and everyone considering the purchase, ensure that you're getting one closest to spec, which is to get the weight and balance pre-measured or a swing weight pre-measured if you can, because my current spec, I would have to sell mine and rebuy it if I want to play with it more competitively, which is a real waste of time and money. For feel and stiffness, this is where a change is most likely going to be felt. The feel is definitely more muted compared to the previous generation on ball contact, but I found myself playing without a dampener for more of its entirety of the testing. And without a dampener, the racket probably feels closer to what you'd get from the Pro Stuff V14 line. After trying about 8 or 9 different string setups, here's my summary of differences. Keep in mind that I'm a very sensitive user when it comes to stiffness and weight changes for customization. Firstly, a stiffer poly at regular tensions for me made the sweet spot a little concentrated, and thus I felt off-center shots to be quite harsh and jarring. The mistake I made when I initially was playing with the blade was that I kept trying to whip into my strokes as if I was playing with an E-zone or an Aero 98, which I'm hitting slightly higher on the string bit. But that spot on the Blade V9 becomes quite jarring to hit constantly over time, so much that at first I thought that the frame was actually much stiffer than the V8. I had to adjust my stroke to a more driving and flatter stroke, which is when you feel the racket performs the best, because at my regular tensions, the higher up on the string bed from the center felt like a dead spot. At lower tensions or thinner gauges, that starts to open up and becomes not so prevalent. So making straight flush contact in the center, whether you're trying to hit flat or topspin, is the best way to use the blade. And I find many of my whippy or handsy swings, even in particular scenarios, just didn't perform as well as you would find on some of these modern day spin rackets. And that is not actually to do with grip styles, because if you know how to use a Western grip and understand how to flatten out, you won't have any problems either. It's only when you're trying to make a little bit more of an angular contact that you start to see the frame flutter and feel a little bit more harsh. Secondly, the only things that I noticed with changes in feel for tension was that if you use an overall soft setup, and even more so at a lower tension, even though they did stiffen up the hoop, you'll notice that the racket starts to flex more to where it becomes more like a V7. And if you struggle for feel and responsiveness, I highly recommend playing without a dampener, because it's the dampener that really hides all the sound, the feel, and the response. Couple that with a very crisp poly such as Alu Power, Tour by Torna Big Hitter Silver 7 Tour in regular gauges. These will certainly offset some of that mutedness. But like I said, it's mainly the dampener that is the issue. For me, True Pro or Tier 1 Firewire Boost still remains as one of my favorite setups in softer frames due to its aggressively triangular shape, so the mains will grab the ball hard for increased launch angle on a racket like this where the launch angle is lower and help you produce some higher margin and spin. And Ghost Wire on the cross still gives you that balance, brings some of that comfort and ball pocketing so it doesn't start to feel like a wooden board. Other setups that I think will also be good would be a full bed of head links tour at a lower tension or a combination of head links tour and head links touch. It definitely feels like one of the softer frames on impact at the moment. And if you take a look at the graph where you'll see the Blade V9 is placed in terms of comfort, I would say slightly more comfortable than the V8 because of that mutedness, but versus heavier rackets, the static weight along with the flex tends to absorb more shock for free, but that comes at a compensation of that additional static weight and maneuverability. As for touch and feel, it's not as high on the board because it has gone back a small step due to that muted feel, but in my opinion not that bad, especially if you get the right string or tension. For power levels, testing alongside the V5, V7 and V8, I would say the power potential has returned closer to on par with the V5. The feel is not as pure as the V5 because the V5 combines a very crisp and solid feel upon contact, but the graphite layers are more of a traditional feel of old school rackets that you would only find in more like a Pro Stock or Angel rackets. The hoop has relatively increased in stiffness and you can see that as it doesn't flutter as much, but the string bed maintains a soft plush feel. Therefore, there seems to be less of a drop off on the receiver's end and the ball can penetrate the court better than the V8. And because the blade plays in a very linear way, you start to get some of those skidding shots back. But you still need to be capable of generating that racket head speed yourself. Let me tell you how important swing style and racket head speed is, as it's easier for me to generate more pace with the Blade V9 than I can with the 3 power rackets that I just reviewed. Because of the speediness of the blade, these power rackets may give you free power, but they have thick beams and are harder to swing through consistently. They are more designed for people who can't generate their own pace and also won't have anywhere near as much control. The racket's feel follows a bit closer to what you find in a lot of modern rackets these days, where if you go for touch or counterpunching type shots, this is where you feel the most ball pocketing happen, which in theory is supposed to help with feel and touch. However, in this case they muted the racket a bit too much where it didn't need to be. On the contrary, if you go for big swings for extreme put away power, this is where you feel the most decrease in the flexibility that they made, where the ball contact at this speed will make the racket feel more rigid, and this is where the slight increase in power potential will come from. You find this happen in rackets like the Wilson Shift and the Yonex Ragnar, and more notably in a recent upgrade with the differences between the Yonex V-Core Pro line and the Percept. The flex of the racket was overtaking the ability for the hoop to retain power in the ball, and the frame would use its flexibility to control the ball instead, rather than put energy back into it. Now that the racket stiffens up at this point of contact, V8 owners might find it a little hard to see that increase in power potential, but this only really happens when you're swinging at 85% or higher. It's marginal, but it's there. And compared to the rest of Blade's closest competitors, there is more penetrating power than the E-Zone, perhaps on par with the V-Core 98 and the Aero 98, but because those two generate a ton of spin, you'll find that it's much easier and more consistent to access the Blade's power through multiple shots and be consistent with it. And that is in part due to the combination of the control and launch angle differences. The gold standard of power on a 98 for me in recent releases was the Gen 3 Pure Strike 98, and it doesn't quite reach those kinds of levels, but there is more than enough put away power when accounting for control to power ratio. It is still one of the best ones available on the market. For maneuverability, the specs that I received, the 330 swing weight, basically ruined my ability to generate the racket head speed that I needed, mainly because the balance did not go well with my swing and it very much dampened my experience with the racket. It also meant that if I wanted to customize to a headlight balance, I would have had to add an extra 15 grams of additional weight to bring it into range of what I like the most, but that 15 grams is still also a detriment to how fast I can swing. In this case, I used a thinner gauge at 1.15 and 1.10 millimeters to decrease the swing weight 6 to 8 points, which brings the racket into a more realistic stock form range so I could test the racket properly. So then once I did that, in general, the blade should be one of the faster moving performing rackets because of its thin beam, which is particularly why the shape has remained unchanged for so long. It's proven to be an effective shape and does not need to change. If you want the fastest 98s for flatter strokes, Blade 98 sits relatively alone because the Technofiber TF40 is fast but a lot more difficult to use, less forgiving and less powerful, doesn't put up the same well-rounded performance as a Blade, especially without weight, which the next closest thing in terms of performance would be the Pure Strike 98, but the strike comes in noticeably thicker and would not get anywhere near as the same speed as you would through the air as the Blade. And finally, with the head Radical MP, in my opinion, needs to be tinkered with weight quite a bit to get the most out of it, whereas the Blade could play ideally perfectly in stock form. It's not the fastest racket, however, because the throat has a boxy shape. The Aero, the Whiteout and the E-Zone are a lot more aerodynamic for short and whippier swings for the purposes of spin and a vertical swing path. But when you're wanting to rip through the ball at a consistently high pace, that's where the Blade shines because its constant 20.6mm beam, unlike where the Aero and E-Zone get much thicker towards the 3 and 9, the Blade is very thin up the top of the racket. So particularly in this category, in its truest stock form, assuming you receive one on the right specs, the Blade V9 and the Regner 98 are probably two of the best performing rackets in all categories without customization in its ideal spec. For the one-hander, it moves quite well. I don't have any problems getting around the ball. The only weakness is probably the lower spin potential for me, which makes it a bit difficult on defense sometimes to create extra safety margin. The Aero and the E-Zone 98 take the cake when it comes to the most maneuverability, but like I said, that is more for a spin stroke. Whereas the Blade V9 and V8 happen to be more maneuverable for a flatter stroke, but given today's game where spin is heavily prioritized, then that's why I would give a higher rating to the others. For control, the launch angle can be fairly low but is consistent, likewise depth comes pretty naturally. The best type of control you get from the Blade is both the ability to drive through the ball precisely, but you can do so whilst achieving more power than you would normally expect from other relatively powerful 98s. Also, the control is part due to the increased stability over the V8. Now that the swing weight builds up that core in stock form, it's going to be much easier to counterpunch and block effectively, so you get that defensive control that is easier than the V8 in stock form, but when it comes time, you can take the reins of attacking all out and playing heavy through the court with open targets or also trying to be laser precise. Now, whilst these rackets here, you're going to find that they're higher rated, but they're higher rated for different purposes. For a control racket, you're going to get lower powered, maybe a tighter pattern, heavier, those kinds of specs where they are more on the advanced type of range. Whereas the Blade literally sits right in the middle where it kind of gives the best of both worlds, where it's a racket that's completely suitable for a pro player, but for a general advanced player, it's still very user friendly. And then it comes to the more lower intermediate range where this is the next step of control and difficulty that you'll find in a racket that you're probably not accustomed to at this stage of your skill level. For spin, the Blade is obviously not known for spin, and whilst truly good players will be able to hit enough of it, the casual and amateur player are likely not going to access it very easily. The launch angle is decently low for a 16-19 but is consistent, but good margin is achievable if needed. However, the heaviness of the spin is not going to wow you in any way, but that doesn't mean you still can't get a very solid arc and high bounce. The strike, for example, has a very high hidden spin potential, but it doesn't move very well on a vertical swing path, or similarly with the Blade having a squared off throat, which makes it less aerodynamic for vertical swing paths. So you have to have a lot more strength or very fast hands to rip underneath the ball. And with the Blade, you'll find that it doesn't perform as well on vertical swing paths, as you'll likely mishit the sweet spot more often than not. The strings just don't grab the ball hard enough, and for me that was a bit of a struggle on my one-hander because I prefer to get a good arc on my backhand on the defense. But the Blade much prefers if you plow or drive through the ball, and if not that, you're better off opening the racket face just to block or redirect. Comparably, you're looking at a similar levels of spin as the Radical MP and the Regner 98, but typically won't match any of the known high spin 98s, which is from the V core, and those are obviously rated higher. Forgiveness is an interesting one with the Blade because it depends on the swing path that you use. Using a traditional rounder and flatter swing, you're not going to have many issues with forgiveness levels. Even at regular tensions, the sweet spot is more than enough for someone who's accustomed to 98s, and it's not like it's going to be a Prestige Pro or Radical Pro or anything like that. String even lower than your reference tension is only going to open up that sweet spot and also reduce the harsher off-center shots. Now what I was saying earlier as to why the off-center shots were harsh and jarring to me is because one, as I said, my wrist is very sensitive to shock and vibrations, but what I was trying to do is be very handsy, whippy and wristy, however you want to call it, and it just doesn't work very well with the blade and is even more accentuated by stiff string setups for sensitive users. Because the strings don't grip onto the ball very well, you need to maximize string bed contact to maximize the performance of the racket. Now on a list of forgiveness levels, I'd say the Blade V9 is as forgiving as the V-Core and the Aero 98. The E-Zone is slightly less forgiving. Then you get down to the Radical MP and the Extreme Tour, and clearly on the more difficult scales you're starting to move into the Radical Pro and Prestige Pro ranges. For stability, if you are comparing apples to apples with the V8 and V9 in stock form, yes, it's certain that you could call the V9 more stable in stock specs, but as I mentioned, that is heavily due to the increased average and swing weight. As I guarantee you, if you play with one that is lower, which is more now considered an under-spec, it's probably going to flutter just as much as the V8 did. But an over-spec'd V8 and a regular V9, I would agree that it's one of the more stable stock rackets that you can get on market, with similar stability levels only being matched by rackets like the Percept 100D or the Regnar 988 in stock form. Return of serves are one of the better shots, especially on my one-hander where I'm only able to ever block the ball in time. I can get a lot more balls back into play because I don't have to do as much work when receiving the ball, and I can still have a relatively light spec to maneuver in time for faster serves. You might note, however, whilst that it is stable, it is not free stability, and what I mean by that is that you can't be hitting off center and expect it to maintain its position steadily. But if you're diligent enough to time it well and make contact flush in the middle, you will notice that it holds very steady. So in that aspect, I would say yes, it is stable, but off center stability, which is also known as kind of like forgiveness, is a little harder to come by. I also tried 2 grams total at 3 and 9 with the leather grip, and what that did was open up the sweet spot a bit wider, which allowed for more forgiveness and free stability. Without the weight, off-center stability was not that great, but in the sweet spot the stability was more than enough than most rackets in stock form. The only comparable stability levels or better are when the swing weights are reaching into the very advanced ranges like a Blade Pro or the T-Fight ISO 305. So whilst on the chart it may look like it's on the mid-tier level, it actually is way beyond its weight class. For serving, blades are a close contender alongside the E-Zone 98 to be some of the best and easiest serving rackets ever created. Its general ease of use is what makes them really outstanding, and whilst the ground strokes shine, the serve is right up there to make the blade a very well-rounded racket. The same deal with the boxier shaped throat will not make it quite as easy to handle as the razor thin throat of an E-Zone 98. For most people that's probably not significant enough to notice, as you're still going to get a lot of freedom of movement with the hand. So you really have full control for minute adjustments and minimal air drag, which means max racket head speed, which translates to precision and power packed together. Slice serves are going to be a killer, and while you might suffer from some of the free topspin potential for kick serves, you're still compensated by how fast you can swing into the ball and underneath it. Slice is a bit of a hit and miss for me. I think it's highly capable to hit slice consistently well, but perhaps it's a little more difficult to achieve and you need a bit more concentration. That is in part due to the strings not grabbing the ball very hard, and if you mistime it you can end up launching a lot higher than you need to. Secondly is that off-center contact doesn't do particularly any favors, so that's why you're going to need a bit more focus to hit it properly. With that being said, the string pattern can be considered a bit more on the controlled side for the 16-19, but that thin beam also perfectly cuts through the air in the motion of a slice. So in that sense, there's a lot of potential there for the skilled slice addicts. Finally, for volleys, you'll find that it's easy to get around, obviously perfect for reflex volleys. You do have to hit them a little bit more clean to realize that stability in the racket there. So you can't just stick your racket out there and expect the racket to do the work for you for free on your volleys, such as rackets like the RF97 or the Shift Pro. You'll have to be a bit more proactive with the legs with good positioning and timing, so that when you do meet the center, then you'll get that beautiful ball pocketing that allows you to control it exactly how you need it, whether you want to hit some drop volleys or putaways. Now, how does the Blade 1820 compare to the 1619 version? I didn't plan on adding this into the review as I only demoed it, but I thought it was too useful not to after I played with it. At times, for many 1820 variants, I always felt that they would be noticeably lower powered due to the density of the string pattern, resulting in a boardier feel, requiring you to string much lower to get a bit more string movement, forgiveness and comfort. The specs that I played with the 1820 that I demoed were that it had the exact same swing weight at 330 as the 1619 that I bought. However, the balance was 32.5 centimeters strung instead of 33.5 centimeters, which was 2 points more headlight than the intended specs and 4 points more headlight than the 1619 that I bought, which is a massive help to maneuverability. And even though it was still at the type of swing weight that was a bit on the higher side, for me it was much more manageable. The racket seemed to be slightly over on the static weight at 327 grams strung, and that weight looks to be distributed to the handle mainly, although I'm not sure how much weight that may be derived from the extra string used in an 1820 string pattern, so I would have to assume possibly a couple of grams, but I've never actually measured it myself. Also, I can't compare to the V8 because I never tried the 1820 in that version. So for the 1820, from the moment I made contact with the ball, even though it was just mini tennis, it was quite a surprise. My racket demo was strung at 53 pounds with Fluxalon Alu Power at 1.25mm gauge, noting that 53 pounds is 5 pounds over my default tension, and remember that I was having some jarring issues with the 1619 version at the same swing weight. Also, that pattern is more open and the tension that I was stringing at was 48 pounds with the same string but in a thinner gauge. So for feel and stiffness, I was definitely expecting that stiff and boardy feel, but instead what I got was a spongy and springy response. What does that mean exactly? Well, the 1820, for whatever reason, it seems actually even softer than the 1619, by quite a lot in fact. The caveat is that it is even more muted, with the 1619 already feeling muted with the dampener in. So actually, the 1820 feels much closer to the V7 in that sense. It is extremely soft and comfortable. Even on the spots higher up on the string bed that I was having jarring sensations, those vibrations were reduced by a noticeable amount. It got a ton of flex and ball pocketing at such a high tension for me, but it wasn't that wet noodle kind, as there was still the feel of mass and some backbone within the frame. So even though it was strung with a string that my wrist considers very stiff, and at a tension I would never imagine using, not only was it even more comfortable, but it was completely playable as well, where I didn't feel there was a lack of power, even though it was strung way higher than what I normally like. For maneuverability, it is essentially going to depend on your spec, and in this case it was one that was in my favor, but it felt a lot nicer to use one even though it was still at my max swing weight that I can handle. For control, this is where it really stood out, as the 1619 was nice for control, but the 1820 was that much better. You can really feel completely confident in hitting all your shots, whereas the 1619 sometimes, if you aren't careful, the frame can seemingly drag the ball out on occasion, probably due to the lacking ability for the strings to grab the ball hard. Whereas the 1820 completely is reliable in every shot that you hit, which is closer to what I feel with my Gravity Pro. Here you can really flatten out any type of spin or high balls and be laser precise when you are balanced and ready to attack. Again, surprisingly, power was not lacking, and even though it might be 5 to 8% lower than the 1619, but that extra control you gain is completely worth the sacrifice, because you'll be better at swinging out more often with increased consistency. That extra control will allow you to unleash more unconsciously, and you may end up hitting harder as a result anyways. Oddly enough, the stability felt even more solid, and in terms of free stability there was noticeably more of that as well, which as I mentioned crosses over with forgiveness. Because off-center shots were providing less shock, I was more than happy to swing through the balls even though I was hitting off-center sometimes and not be reprimanded by the vibrations, which gave me more confidence to play. All this also transferred to volleys, where it just felt quite a bit sturdier and also more forgiving on mistimed volleys, but in the same maneuverable package. And obviously Slice no longer had that issue. I felt that I could accidentally hit sitters, as denser string patterns are always just more automatic. Serves were also more impressive because there was a feeling of actual mass and plow through from that loaded stability, but that bonus of additional control was completely felt throughout as well. I was also able to gel with it immediately compared to the 1619, whereas you felt like you relied purely on hand speed to get the power, and whilst it was powerful, it didn't feel as good to crush the serve, whereas the 1820 at contact would just melt through the ball. So who's this racket for? Provided you get an on-spec blade, whilst it does not completely match up to previous golden generations such as the V5 due to the feel still not being as pure as it used to be, the blade in stock specs maintains high relevance in the market as always as one of the best well-rounded rackets as an option for intermediate all the way up to pro level players. Why it remains one of the best rackets on market is due to its versatile nature, most suited for high level attacking tennis, but completely capable of changing up and counterpunching and defending at a moment's notice. The extra stability in the V9 due to the heightened swing weight is definitely a welcome addition compared to the V8, which was coming in as a platform racket. Despite the subpar feel for true purists, for newer players who are not feel focused yet and are looking to bring your game to the next level, I can see no better middle of the line option than the Blade 98 or the Blade 100. It may not be much of an upgrade for V8 users and a preference where there is enough of an upgrade or not, but you can't go too wrong with a blade of any generation. A lot of people will have their opinion on what they like the most, but I used the Countervail blade for a couple of years as my main racket and I thought it was a great racket despite being one of the most hated generations. If you're not so picky with feel, the V9 is a great starting point for anyone looking to dive into the realm of a advanced player racket or someone who's using a heavy racket and may want to dial down the specs a little bit for user friendliness. The V8 is also just as good if you can customize it or find a heavier spec, and at the moment they're super cheap on sale for a premium quality racket. You might not feel that percentage boost in power level, but you're hard to go wrong with any blade. Ideally, in my opinion, for NTRP 4.0 and higher, but still has some use cases for 3.5s where you're just looking to transition to the next level. In the UTR system, I would say probably 5 and upwards. All in all, my final thoughts was that the 1820 was way more impressive to me than the 1619, where I felt that almost every category was an enhancement, with the only two compromises being the more muted feel and marginally less power, but not to a point of concern for me personally. Feel and responsiveness likewise improved with removing the dampener whilst playing with a crisp string like Aloe Power, which also helps. When I initially played the 1619, I thought there was a potential of consideration to rebuy it at the spec that I preferred, but after hitting with the 1820, that has thrown those plans out the window, and I would much rather get the 1820 if I were to rebuy the blade. Anyway, that concludes my review. Check out my racket ratings at the end of the video for the overall summary. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.